Welcome to the lABLEd podcast, a show about disability, illness and difference. I'm Lucy.
And I'm Alice.
And that's Lola.
Kaleidoscope identity, and this is who I'm meant to be. I'm just labelled me. I'm just labelled me.
Hi guys! Don't forget, in this episode, I might swear, Lucy might cry, and you can check out details of the trigger warnings on our website. Please be aware that in this episode, we will be discussing Nazis and the Holocaust. Hi everyone! Welcome to the lABLEd podcast. We're doing something a bit special this week. We have decided, because it is Autism Awareness Week, that we are going to do a week's worth of content dedicated especially to autism and raising awareness about autism and topics related to autism.
So basically, what we're trying to tell everybody is you've got a week's worth of so every day this week. Is that right? Every day this week, an episode of the podcast is coming out. You lucky listeners.
Yeah, and we've decided to give you something really good to kick off with. The only reason any of you keep listening, our very own personal tame historian, Daisy's back.
Daisy's back! Hello, Daisy!
Hello! I'm really intrigued where this characterization of being tame came from. I feel like I wasn't consulted on this. And then
I am very aware we sound like Steve Wright as well, with the clapping and the woo! Like Radio 2 afternoon.
That's all right. No one claps to me enough. I'm here in the house on my own. I need a round of applause sometimes.
So, Daisy, what are you going to tell us about that's to do with autism?
Well, it may be easy to puzzle it out. It's some kind of listener quiz. I'm a historian, and it is Autism Awareness Week. What do you think I'm going to be talking about?
Oh, I know this. Is it the history of autism?
Yes, it is. Well done.
Yay!
You get a round of applause too.
I was going to say kittens.
I could probably talk about kittens for this length of time as well, but but the history of autism is what is on the paper. So
okay.
I had to go all the way up a set of stairs to print this out. So.
Well, we appreciate the effort, and hopefully our listeners will as well.
Yeah, so the difficulty we have with talking about the history of disability in general, kind of history of any kind of disability, or, neurodiversity or a health problem or mental illness or anything like that, is the problem of trying to retroactively diagnose people.
Mm.
As you can imagine, that's quite difficult for people who kind of lived not just before, the current diagnostic criteria that we use, but before the word autism existed at all. There's a similar phenomenon in LGBTQIA plus history of, sort of retroactively sort of claiming people as, gay icons or trans icons and things like that. And, it's difficult because you just can't know for sure.
I've said on the show before, I think, about how I think it's important not to label people ourselves, but to sort of look for people who have labelled themselves. I think I don't necessarily think it's our place to be applying labels to people who haven't identified with them. And that's obviously difficult in, history terms, but certainly in terms of celebrities and stuff like that in the modern day, I think that's something that people should be a bit more wary of, rather than saying, well, that's a gay icon. If that's somebody who hasn't felt comfortable coming out and saying, I am, this is what my sexuality is.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of working on an estimate of, say, maybe, 40-50% of the people who I will mention in terms of history of autism probably might have actually been autistic. But it's kind of, I consider it all part of the history of it, even if they wouldn't necessarily cross it, because it's the history of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
Essentially. And, part of that is the people who, you know, might have filled those criteria but might not have. You know, unfortunately, if you only consider the, you know, the people who definitely had it, then this will be very, very short.
Yes. Well, and again, with something like autism, it is a spectrum. So there will be people who, you know, don't identify as being autistic, who have some of the criteria, you know, and it's a spectrum. So it's even more difficult. Whereas, you know, my eye condition, that's what she's got. Whereas it's difficult with something like autism and neurodiversities to be able to actually accurately diagnose and label people.
Yeah.
So Daisy, what were people sort of autism wasn't a thing? There wasn't the diagnosis of autism available. What did people who had those types of symptoms, what were they known as? You know, what was their label back then?
Their labels were sort of terms which we tend to use a lot of still nowadays, but have, you know, roots in describing people with, you know, learning disabilities, neurodiversity, intellectual impairments, all those sorts of things. So one that comes up quite frequently, in particular with autism, is idiot.
Right.
So that would be someone with a kind of profound learning disability, but that seems to refer more to the non-verbal side of things. So you will also see, you know, the terms like moron and dumb, and so also because of some of these people are non-verbal, there is an assumption that they're deaf as well, because obviously that could be the only possible reason why they don't want to talk to you. It's just that they can't hear you. No other reason. Yeah, so idiot will come up a few times.
Right.
Okay.
And I think it is safe to say that anytime I'm talking about disability history, there is a content warning for potentially offensive terms for disability may well be used, because I don't like to sort of try and censor that stuff too much.
No, I think it's important to use the language that people were using at the time, because it says a lot about the context of the person you're talking about. That's the language that people were using about them.
History is not nicey, is it? It's not.
I had to write that just this morning.
History is not nicey.
I actually said history is not nicey.
True.
A doctoral proposal by Daisy Holder.
Wondering if you've been in my head, Lucy. Yeah, so kind of one of the earliest versions of what could be considered autism that you hear about is one that a lot of the neurodiverse community have been learning more about in recent years, and a lot of them have kind of taken on, you know, that sort of identity marker themselves. So that's the idea of changelings.
Okay.
So these were from stories, myths, fairy tales from all over the place, like Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, mainly. So the idea was that someone's baby or young child would be perfectly average, typical, boring. And then suddenly, overnight in some cases, the baby would change.
Right.
The idea is that the actual original baby had been stolen and then replaced with a changeling that wasn't quite a real baby.
Swapped for like a fairy baby, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes,
it was fairies going around swapping things, because, you know, fairies, while tiny, are surprisingly strong, apparently.
That tooth fairy's got a lot to answer for, hasn't she, really?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so, you know, people considered this when, you know, with a change of behaviour, but also sometimes the baby was just clearly unhappy. They were just like, oh, no, can't be anything I'm doing wrong. No, it must be those fairies. It's definitely the fairies. So yeah, that's one that people have really kind of, you know, taken on as their own, kind of reclaimed almost, which I think is great.
Yeah.
In a way.
Well, I was going to say, if you gave me the option human or fairy, I know what I'm going to fucking pick.
Well, you get wings, don't you?
And magic.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the changelings themselves have magic. I should rifle through my bits of paper more. Let's do myself a nice doodle here.
Just call me Tinkerbell from now on, please.
Yeah. So that's a really good sign that neurodiversity has always existed. You know, there have always been these people with behaviours that people haven't really been able to fully understand, and for the what I'm deeming the slightly more documented history, which is kind of, you know, someone actually wrote it down on a bit of paper that then I was able to read. That's taken to the 16th century.
Wow.
So that's, 1500 through to 1599, because the way that centuries and years match up isn't particularly intuitive. So you've got Martin Luther. So you may be familiar with him, but not remember why he was famous. And that is perfectly fine, because I was in that camp before I started doing this research as well.
Okay.
He is that one who essentially created the Protestant church
Okay.
by getting very angry and forcing a split from the Pope.
Right.
He was also a writer, theologian, philosopher, all of that. In his various writings, he would go around the country, around the continent, around the world, meeting all different people. And he wrote about it all. And so there's one of his books, which is from a load of notes that he took. One in particular called The Table Talk, where he described a young boy, about 12 years old, fits the criteria of the modern
diagnosis.
Diagnostic, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so fit the criteria for that. He described that child as a soulless mass of flesh possessed by the devil.
Wow.
Whoa. I mean, don't mince your words, mate.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So, this was not uncommon. Obviously, the idea that any kind of disability or mental deficiency would be down to, the devil, sin. Mm-hmm. It was all your fault, but also God's fault or the devil's fault, or it's hard. Yeah, they keep changing their minds quite a lot.
It's either God or the devil. It's God or Satan is to blame.
It's one of them, yeah. But it's kind of, I feel people do have this impression that was kind of always the interpretation of historical views of autism in particular, but also disability in general. That's not really the case. So there's many people who believe the complete opposite. Okay, so this is going to be hard to explain.
Okay. Strapping in.
There were these people called the Holy Fools of Russia.
Right.
Okay.
So they are a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. They did exist in other things as well. That sort of the idea of being foolish for God. But the Holy Fools of Russia, some researchers now think that they, or at least some of the members of that group, could have been autistic as well. They've existed since like the 4th century.
Wow.
Right through. And they're well known for running around naked in the middle of winter, being disruptive and immoral in town centres, and claiming to be a prophet.
Okay.
Which naturally, these were all signs to the Orthodox Church that they were extremely pious and religious. Because nothing says commitment to religion more than claiming to be a prophet.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily smack of neurodivergence to me. It sounds more like someone who's been drinking too much.
Yeah.
So they've had a few too many sherbets, I think.
Well, so these were people who kind of followed the what they term like ascetic type version of religion. So, they're nomadic. They only, absolutely as much as they need to, sort of singular grains of rice, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Traveling around, sleeping outside, not having to talk to other people. So I suspect it was those kind of later points rather than the necessary, idiosyncrasies within it. Shoplift. There's some particularly good names of these people, which I would like to take this opportunity to share with you.
Absolutely.
John the Hairy. Basil the Blessed.
Right.
I like that.
And John Big Cap.
Big Cap.
John Big Cap.
Now, is that because he had the particularly large head accessory, or is it in reference, do you think, to some other part of his anatomy?
Allegedly, it was a headgear.
Okay.
But he covered himself in chains so that it would be more difficult for him to walk around.
I thought you were going to say covered himself in cheese.
What? I mean, you might have done that too. Hang on, I'll check the notes.
I don't know why. Oh, chains. Okay.
So sorry, I would miss Lucy's cheese comment overwrote. Why did he cover himself in chains?
So the implication is that they go to a lot of effort to make their lives more difficult, to show their dedication to God.
That
being a martyr?
It's like
Yes. And so the idea was that they were deliberately acting. the view of the church at the time, is that they were deliberately acting as if they were mad so that people wouldn't know how truly one with God they were and feel jealous.
Right, okay.
And so chains, yeah, I mean, I think covering oneself in chains is probably less pleasant than covering oneself in cheese, so I can see.
Yes, but still probably more so than covering one's naked self in snow. Apparently they did too. I wouldn't really necessarily recommend it.
Russia as well, like when we get snow here, the Russians are like bikini weather.
Yeah. There was a monk called Brother Juniper,
right,
who was one of these, considered a holy fool, but not of the Eastern Orthodox kind, of the other kind. So he was a monk under Francis of Assisi.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really trying to cling on to the names that people will recognise. Yeah, but look, Brother Juniper took the order of, the different rules of the Order of Francis of Assisi so seriously and so literally, to the extent that he spent most of his life really irritating a lot of people.
Okay.
So he just sort of never really understood why. So that
he didn't know he was being irritating, or
no, he had no idea.
Right, okay.
I suppose, not having autism myself, I don't necessarily have the lived experience of it, but you certainly see in representations that people with autism do kind of irritate and bother other people because there is the sort of representation of them being pedantic or, very kind of to the letter and immoving about things. So I can understand sort of, seeing that relation, especially for something that is, amongst holy orders are going to be something that's really going to be drilled into them. So there's not
much wiggle room, is there?
Exactly. Yeah. And if that's how your autism kind of presents, I can see, again, why.
It's like if somebody tells you to be quiet and you struggle to be quiet, you could see why that would get irritating to everybody else who is being quiet. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So the legend goes that they had come across a sick man, and they had been tending to the sick man, and Juniper asked whether there was, anything he could do that would make this sick man feel better. And the man said that, I'd really fancy a meal of pig's feet. And so Juniper went, oh, okay, and ran off into the forest, found a pig, and just cut off its foot.
Oh my God.
Oh.
And then ran back, cooked the meal and all that. And then the farmer who owned the pigs found one of his pigs there with just one of its feet.
I imagine bleeding to death slowly.
Yeah, and was just sort of quite annoyed about the whole thing.
I can imagine, yeah.
And so just sort of turned up and started yelling at them.
Right.
And Juniper thought that he just sort of didn't understand what had happened. So he was still going, oh, but he was sick and he wanted this and now I got it for him. Isn't that great? And once the farmers, realised that he was a sort of, simple religious man and so friendly and all of that, and he hadn't, he was doing it for a good reason, they forgave them and gave them the rest of the pig as a gift. But so a lot of these behaviours in the kind of historical religious sense was kind of like a sign of being one and true with God and their religion. He was seen as one of the most pious one of them all because because his, I guess as they saw it, as long as he was being kind, that was the only thing. He wasn't weighed down by the idea of needing to please people in the mortal world. Obviously, I'm not saying that analysis is necessarily, correct as far as our understanding of neurodiversity today, but...
No, but it's interesting. It's basically saying, if you're unencumbered by the other trials and tribulations of humanity and all that you think about is being kind and caring for a person, it does take away sort of all the bullshit, doesn't it? It strips all of that back. And I can certainly see why a person would align that to kind of godliness. It's, in theory, God is there to just say, you're good, you're bad. There's not really messing around with grey area, whereas, intent and things like that is what makes area's grey.
Yeah. No, I mean, he got sainted. So
Really?
good job, Juniper.
Saint Juniper.
Yes, Juniper had all his miracles.
See, did he happen to become the patron saint of gin? Because I think gin makes me very kind and thoughtful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you're embodying the spirit of Saint Juniper every time you drink it.
Yeah.
You just remember him.
Yeah, I will next time I have a drink.
Yeah, you absolutely should. So by then we're getting into the sort of, 17th, 18th century when people are writing things down a little bit more.
Okay.
Which is great for me. So otherwise it's a lot of me staring at my computer shrugging.
Which doesn't come out very well on a podcast, does it?
No, and it doesn't get much done either. It's just sort of scowling at it. Why won't you tell me more things? So the reason we know so much about this next guy is because there are court records.
Okay.
That's always a good sign.
He's going to be interesting.
Yes, so he was known as the Daft Lad of Borg.
Right.
So daft is another word that sometimes people use as just sort of, I mean, it's still now what it meant then, which is sort of, a bit eccentric.
Right.
But inevitably, it would be,
like reading between the lines. Yeah.
Yeah. Just because, they didn't have a better way of describing it.
No.
It's sort of, what's going on with that Borg lad? I don't know. He's a bit daft.
Yeah. I mean, all of these words are creeping unpleasantly close to phrases like retard, which is not a word that is acceptable in any sense, if you ask me. But it's the same kind of they're almost synonyms of one another, aren't they? Or moving close to that. Idiot, daft. It's that, as you said at the beginning, there's still the same sort of words that we might use to insensitively describe learning difficulties and neurodivergence and cognitive impairments.
Yeah. So I think it was some point last year I actually wrote an article on this on my website, which is basically like a I was going to say thesaurus. Thesaurus isn't the word I'm looking for. Like a dictionary, I guess, almost of disability history. Yeah, sort of like, so it's got, all of the words that, so if you're researching disability history, then it's the words that you might come across and what they mean, but also the background of a lot of these words that are still really common and how they came from disability history.
Like a glossary.
Glossary, yes, that's the word I was going for. But yeah, so it's really interesting where a lot of these words come from. Yeah, so the Daft Lad's actually called Hugh Blair. Mm-hmm. And he was a lord from Scotland.
Right.
Which is another reason why we know some amount of information about him. Can't deny how much being rich helps.
Mm-hmm.
So he had many of what are considered unusual behaviours. So some of them, like fixations, repetitive acts, obliviousness to social cues, are very typical of autism.
Is this the guy who thought his dad was a turkey? I'm going to say no.
Know.
By that face, I'm going to say no. No, it's not.
It's like, what?
No, it might well be. My sources are never like completely going to say everything. The whole point with disability history is that like you end up having to pick it from so many different places because no one has really made it before and sort of put it together very much. And so, there isn't just sort of like a book I can go and find about this guy, which will have all of it in. So a lot of his behaviours were sort of, typical of what you would, consider autism now. Others not so much. They come up with, when you're reading these sources, it's kind of like, this is a list of reasons why I think this particular thing. And it was, the reasons why people would consider him unusual. Mm-hmm. And one of them was always eating alone and letting the cat eat off his plate. which I don't think is all that unusual.
No.
Well, and I have a cat, and it's not really a question of letting the cat eat off your plate. It's usually more of a desperate fight for whatever you can get.
Is that, as far as I'm concerned, the other rich people were boring, and the cat was really cute.
Yeah.
Well, and lots of people prefer to eat alone.
Yeah. So a slightly less typical, but still quite funny, I think, one. So he wore the same piece of clothing every single day, holes in it, starting to fall apart. So in order to fix it, he would cut bits off of other people's clothes without them noticing and fix it.
I like that.
They don't specify, but I like to think that they were wearing it at the time where he cut it off.
Is that a bit like people who say, I've had that broom for like 27 years, I've only replaced the head twice and the handle 3 times. So actually, it's not.
Yeah. It is quite a bit like that, yeah.
Yeah.
So 1747 was the court case.
Right.
That was the court case between him and his younger brother. So because Hugh was the eldest son of the family, he was due to, inherit everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, the title, the manor, all of the, family home, everything. His younger brother became his legal guardian sort of about 10 years before this court case, because it was considered that he obviously had the title of lord, because that's not really, you're a lord or you're not. There's no kind of you don't need guardianship to be called a lord.
No.
But in a sort of, and it's not something that I've come across that many times before. It's the idea of someone becoming a legal guardian for an adult at this sort of early. Yeah, they seem to determine that was necessary. So this court case in 1747 was because Hugh got married.
Okay.
And I suppose if somebody thinks you require legal guardianship, it's, I guess, making that decision?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So it was about a year between him actually getting married and the court case, which, considering back then the courts didn't necessarily have the same delays that they currently do in the CPS and court trials and things like that, is sort of relatively quick but not immediate. It almost gives you the impression that they're sort of giving it a chance.
Yeah,
at least, or just an opportunity. I mean, I suppose it could also mean that the brother wasn't paying attention and didn't notice until ages later. But I like to think it's the former.
Yeah.
So his brother petitioned the court to have the marriage annulled.
Okay.
right.
And did Hugh have any say in it? Well, I take it he didn't, did he? If they're going to court?
No, not really, because he was a guardian. But it was hard to tell whether he understood that he was married.
Right. Okay.
So they did a test to sort of try and judge his competency,
but
it was essentially pointless because it was a written questionnaire, and I doubt it was particularly accessible or anyone had really explained it to him or anything like that. So he ended up just sort of copying out what was written on, copying out the question in the answer section.
Right.
Because, there's writing and then blank spaces. I mean, to be fair, I would, if you had no idea what was happening, you may well just go, oh, maybe they're testing my handwriting or, Yeah,
it's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. So they asked him whether he wanted to marry, and he said yes. And then they asked him if he wanted to not marry, and he said yes. And they asked if he wanted to marry a woman, said yes. If he wanted to marry a man, he said yes. And he just always agreed.
Right.
And so kind of based on that, they annulled it. And obviously, it's impossible for us to know whether that was the right decision, because the people writing it down for me to read think that it was right.
Exactly.
So, if there was something else that implied that maybe they weren't entirely right in doing it, they probably wouldn't have written it down.
No.
I can't imagine they were making that decision for Hugh's benefit or in his best interest. They were making that decision because Hugh was the eldest son, and so he was the one who was going to inherit. If he got married and had children, then they would be the ones to inherit. And that will have been what was driving their decision, is worries about money, not necessarily worries about whether this was a consensual relationship that made him happy.
Yeah, so arguably because he was the legal guardian, that would have sort of so his father had already died by this point. his father had died when both of the kids were quite young. So he already had the title, and I'm imagining the legal guardian being like almost like how power of attorney would work now. So it's kind of like the money would technically be Hugh's, but it would be his brother who had the final yes or no as to how it was used. So I guess arguably he already had access to all of the money anyway and didn't need to know. But yeah, I admit that I am trying to see the niceties.
Well, and it's not necessarily the use of the money now, it's the inheriting the money further down the line. If he gets married and has children, then it's going to go to them, whereas if he stays a bachelor and something were to happen to him, then it goes legal guardian or not, it's his money now. But I always like to see the worst in people. So.
So that was a surprisingly kind of like well documented case of that sort of thing.
Do we know what happened to him in the end?
Well, from what we can tell, he had a perfectly happy adult life and died at an age appropriate to I think he was in his late 50s or early 60s.
It's not bad for the 1700s.
No, that's not so bad. As we say, the reports are limited, but everything indicates that he was happy enough in himself.
Well, that's good. Well done, Hugh.
So it's that same century you get. So you notice how a lot of the history of autism is kind of like individual stories of people. It's purely because this essentially only started being researched as a phenomenon. I think it's about 1850 or 1840 is like the earliest example of it actually being researched, which still, to be fair, is earlier than I thought it was when I started doing this research.
To be fair, I thought you were going to say autism people didn't start recognizing it until like 1940 something. So I think that is better than I expected.
But as we know, this the date that autism was invented, 6th of October 1944 or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly.
The classic. But so this is another one that some people might have heard of, and it's one where the idea of this sort of child being autistic is a bit sort of patchy for me. It's so hard to tell. But it's the wild boy of Aveyron. Some people may well have heard about him. He was found living feral in the woods south of France, entirely non-verbal, and been living alone there for about 7 years.
How did he get there?
What some researchers think now is that it seems that he was abandoned by his parents. And some people think that he was born with autism and then abandoned by his parents because of
the autism.
Yes, but all of the sort of behaviours and signs that they report as, and kind of looking at it almost like, oh, maybe they could have been autistic traits. I'm going, or could have been living on his own in the woods for 7 years.
Yeah, well, and the abandonment of children and things like that, unfortunately, is not necessarily that unusual, though.
No, it wasn't. Someone surviving surviving it is unusual.
So it is that almost chicken and egg of it, isn't it? Was he just abandoned because the family couldn't afford to feed him and knew that if they got rid of him they could continue to feed themselves and then have another child?
Or was it the fact that he was so run away wild?
They struggled to manage his behaviour.
So when he was found, he was taken to a nice lady in the next village where he stayed for about a day and then went, oh no, this is terrible, and ran away back to the woods again. And then I think it was another about 18 months before anyone saw him again. He was considered to be deaf and mentally ill.
Right.
Deaf because he was non-verbal, and mentally ill because at this point, particularly in Europe, mentally ill was kind of used as like a catch-all term,
right?
For kind of an illness or disability that they thought came from inside the head. So so it's not necessarily that
mental illness doesn't mean the same thing now as it did then.
It kind of covered sort of mental illness and neurological illness and all things like that they just sort of like, it's from inside the big coconut on your neck somehow.
I mean, they used to think that other illnesses were caused by like biles and humours, so I feel like them being able to identify that it's something that is perhaps caused by something that's going on in your head is a pretty impressive step forward from it's the yellow biles in your liver.
Yeah, better drink some phlegm or whatever it was you were supposed to do.
Let's get some leeches on you.
Yeah. He was found again and then taken in by more people and, studied a bit as it happened.
Did he run away again?
I think he tried a few times, and then if I remember rightly, he actually died quite young.
I'm not surprised, really. I mean,
they liked to do that sort of thing, even with natives in places that the white European Christians turned up and went, "Oh, this is ours now," and they looked at the natives who have been living in the jungles or the forests, minding their own business, having their own culture, and being perfectly happy for hundreds and thousands of years, and they go, "Oh, no, you can't do that. You must go to go to a mission, like a missionary, and learn to be a proper human.
Yeah, put some shoes on and be a proper human."
Yeah, basically.
I can't see them being the most nurturing for somebody who has perhaps got communication needs and has not been brought up in what their understanding of civilization is.
Well, yes, I mean, compared to all of those people, Alone in the Woods sounds quite nice.
Certainly, like compared to 17th century hyper-religious France, I would much happy, my dad lives in France now and he's always sending me pictures and telling me all these nice stories about all the random wildlife. He's got like deers and shit just hanging. It sounds so much better than French Catholics.
Like a Disney film.
Yeah.
So get some little birds to help you put on your jacket.
Yeah, exactly.
He
was basically being Snow White.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, "No, you mustn't do that. You must use a knife and fork.
Put some shoes on."
Yeah.
What is your obsession with people putting shoes on?
I just think it's very civilized to wear shoes.
That's the true definition of when civilization started. I have to remake that whole series.
Yeah. Sorry, Daisy, we've been very naughty in your history lesson, aren't we, here?
No, not at all. Right, yes, so the first research.
Mm-hmm.
So this was done by a doctor called Samuel Howe, or Howe. It's Howe, and I think it's Howe. Yeah. So he was the founder of the Perkins School for the Blind in America, which is where Helen Keller and Laura Bridgman were educated.
Mm-hmm.
The fictional Helen Keller, you mean?
Yeah.
Don't even get me started.
Thank you, TikTok.
So they both studied there. Laura Bridgman before Helen Keller. I've also written about Laura Bridgman, if anyone's interested.
Yeah.
Subtle plug. So he learned from kind of setting up that place from educating, deaf-blind students, that essentially all disabled children were able to learn in some way, and it was just a case of figuring out how. He believed that all children deserved, at least the opportunity of education.
Revolutionary ideas even now.
So this was 1840s.
Okay.
And he led a survey of what is called the Commonwealth's known idiots.
Wow.
What a title.
I know, yeah. So
I feel like they should all have that on the back of their jackets and be start like some kind of football team.
Yeah, that would be great.
The known idiots.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically, everyone in America who was on this sort of list. And, they would ride around on their horses and then, get their tape measures out and start measuring people and taking notes and finding out, how many people there were out there who were, as they classified, idiots.
Does this include all the cranial measurements and stuff like that? Or because I know that was a big thing around that time.
Yeah. So there's all the cranial measurements. As far as you can tell, Howe hadn't yet connected that to any kind of eugenics and horrible racism type things.
Yeah.
But give it time.
Yeah. It won't be long.
When white men are involved, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. We're not too far away from that. He'd found loads of people who just didn't seem to fit along with, all of the other idiots that he was finding.
Okay.
They didn't fit the standard, parameters.
They didn't fit your standard idiot, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while some of them seem to have, issues with communication, a lot of them were incredibly intelligent and provably so, and incredibly skilled in these different ways. He wrote that it was difficult to say whether this person should be called an idiot.
Right.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I think even still, autism is considered by many to be a learning disability or difficulty, and that's not necessarily the point. Your needs, if you have them as a person with autism, is more about kind of communication and understanding social cues and things like that. It's not necessarily a question of intellect in the same way that you might see with these other, I suppose, kinds of idiots that he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It also comes into that whole kind of, special interest thing that a lot of people have. There is this kind of assumption that, if someone was a idiot in the way they were describing, it was sort of, synonymous with, a low IQ.
Yeah.
Which obviously wasn't the case for these people. And that kind of started off this kind of boom of research into these people who, it's kind of like, well, it's like they're deficient, but they're not, huh?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, he found himself very confused, not wanting to, call them idiots. I'm like, well, yeah, you shouldn't, but not for the reason you think. Could you just not?
Yeah, he doesn't want to call them idiots because that's not the right offensive terminology to use. Let's think of something else horrible we can call them.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, but it's kind of, but a lot of these stories have been, I guess what many people would describe as kind of human oddities. These are the people who have stood out because, their behaviour is unusual enough to become noteworthy.
Right.
Yeah.
But obviously this exists, in all fields of life and in all subjects, and so a scientist, particular one, there are a number of historical scientists who very much seem to have, been neurodiverse, have, autism. So it's like Henry Cavendish is a scientist who's now thought to have had Asperger's syndrome.
Yeah.
So he had a secret staircase at the back of his house to avoid having to speak to anyone. And again, I maintain that's just good sense.
Yeah.
I
don't think that's a autistic thing. I think that's just...
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't like talking to people and you've got the cash, then do it.
Build another front door.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you?
The actual front door then becomes the fake front door.
Yeah. So he was best known for discovering hydrogen.
Okay.
He called it inflammable air, which I think is a much better name for it.
Yeah, that's dead cool, isn't it? Yeah.
It's so much better.
Inflammable air.
He was always very, one of those people where, the neighbours would say, well, he keeps himself to himself.
Mm-hmm.
One of those. Most of his scientific advances weren't discovered until after he died. Because, he
kept himself to himself and wasn't going, look what I did.
Didn't speak to people to such an extent, was uncomfortable around other people, from what we can tell.
What a way for your findings and work to be uncovered, though, to keep it quiet all of your life, not because you want to, but because you purely don't like communicating with other people, and then for somebody to find all that work in notebooks when you've passed away that's quite...
I suppose it's what you're in it for, though. If you're in it because you love science and you love research and you love discovering things, then that's great. If you're in it for the notoriety, then it's not what you want at all.
No.
I mean, it's a shame that it means he wasn't sort of respected and recognised in his lifetime, and in an ideal world,
isn't he?
Yeah,
posthumously is recognised. I think that is quite amazing, and also that's a little bit sad. Do you know what I mean? That's quite touching, I think, to go all of your life and then not really have that your discovery and your work talked about, and then when you've passed away, what a legacy that is to leave behind for other people.
Yeah, I mean, what you really need in an ideal world would have been the opportunity for him to do his research and all of that, and there to be a space for him to be able to communicate his discoveries in a way that he felt safe doing so.
Yeah.
And then a nice barrier between him and everybody else who was going to consume that information.
It's almost like having a press conference and then like giving your findings and going, I should be accepting no further questions. Thank you very much. That kind of...
Yeah. It's sort of a nice window. Just throw the science out of the window and then shut it again.
Yeah. Go, you lot deal with this.
Yeah. This is your problem now.
I've done the legwork.
Yeah. See, this is where we start talking about the psychiatrists.
Okay.
Oh, cool. This should be fun.
Yeah. So, I mean, psychiatrists have been describing the patients they had with what we call autistic tendencies for like decades. They've been describing people who had, a lack of attachment and a narrow range of deep interests, and talking about themselves in the third person as well, from like, the start of the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these assumptions that this was sort of rooted in a person's emotional development was what originally led to the term autism. So it was a Swiss psychiatrist, Bleuler, I think it said. I cannot confirm or deny whether that's how you pronounce it. Eugen Bleuler, I think.
I apologise to any Swiss listeners.
Oh God, yeah. I'm sorry. I'm butchering your beautiful language.
Yeah.
He sort of made up the word to describe a symptom of schizophrenia.
Okay.
So using it to mean withdrawing into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Although the words that he used were a morbid self-admiration and withdrawal of the patient to his fantasies, which is like rude and also not very clear. But, that's what happens when you try and talk to a doctor from like 1910.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like somebody who lies in bed and worries a little bit about how they might die and what could happen to them at any moment. And that has been the last 25 years of my life. So
yes, I mean, for ages and ages, autism was considered a symptom or a subtype of schizophrenia. It's only shockingly recent that it was actually changed in the DSM, which is like the American version of the Big Book of Mental Disorders, and it was changed so that it didn't say that. So you see old scientific papers and things referring to autistic psychopathy.
Okay,
psychopathy was just sort of a thing, it was a description of a way someone felt about themselves, rather than necessarily as we would
understand psychopathy.
Yes, it's today we would understand sort of psychotic to be something kind of particularly bad. It hadn't quite had time to pick up that stigma yet at this point.
Okay.
So yeah, it does sound really brutal if you're sort of talking about autistic psychopathy, but autistic psychopathy was attributed in a lot of cases to something they refer to as refrigerator mothers. So that would be like a cold, unloving guardian with milk and eggs inside and some holiday magnets.
Daisy, this is why you are so much funnier than me and Alice. Just that deadpan delivery of...
It's going fine until milk and eggs.
No, but it's true though, isn't it? You have milk and you have eggs. Yes, as a woman. Yes.
Yeah, so in order for... calling it a separate phenomenon was quite a bit later. So that is when you're getting towards the 1930s, more kind of the era that you two were thinking about starting to be less shit about autism in general.
Oh no, I never said that it was less shit. I just said that was when I imagined people started going, oh yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah.
I didn't say it's good.
Oh no. By no means am I implying that less shit means good. So if people have looked up the history of autism before, we're now probably getting into the region that they may have heard some things about.
Yeah.
So this is essentially where, if you are looking up at the history of autism from certain places, this is essentially where it starts, according to some of these places, will be essentially, when the word was invented and people started separating it from schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Dr. Kanner. He made the first documented case for it being a separate phenomenon.
Yeah.
Although we think a neurologist from the Soviet Union probably did earlier, but you just can't really prove that because haven't seen the thing written down.
Right. Okay.
It's one of these kind of like lost forever kind of things. But we think there was possibly before, but sort of simultaneous idea as well. He wrote a big, long, boring paper about childhood schizophrenia, which made references to these kinds of behaviours like in autism. And the father of a child from somewhere in America sent him this big long letter back describing their eldest son, and that son was called Donald Triplett, and he has been deemed case number 1 for the new brackets, not actually that new, condition of autism.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so he is
the 30s,
40s, this kind of era. All of this is happening. So he was alive until relatively recently. And by relatively recently, I'm now realising that it's 2020, and so it's probably not actually recently at all.
Also not 2020, so...
2020s.
2020s, yeah.
So yeah, I think he died in the 80s or 90s. So
pretty recent, to be fair.
Yeah, it's nice and recent for those of us who were born in the 80s. It's really only a few years ago. We're still young.
Yeah.
We're still children.
I don't think I want to go children, but
young 20s-ish.
If you become a child, you have to do the teenager all over again.
No. I'll say anywhere between the age of 24 and 31. I'll stick in that range.
In that bracket.
Yeah. Nothing else, thanks.
No.
God, do I have to really embrace these last few years of being in that bracket then?
Yes. It is only downhill from there.
Oh, God. Quick, I don't have time to do this with you. I have to live my life. You just hear footsteps and then a car door slamming. Right, so remember
Donald Triplett.
Yes, Donald Triplett and Dr. Kanner.
Okay.
So it was around the same time as Dr. Kanner that you had Dr. Asperger. You may remember that name from...
It's somewhat familiar.
Yeah, from, a lot of things that you hear about and have happened. So Dr. Asperger was studying a larger group than Dr. Kanner had. So Dr. Kanner had been, sent letters about kind of individual people at a time because, he was in the first stages of research. And so, his first paper on autism was about, hey, look at this guy, Donald. Autism case number 1.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Asperger was doing it a bit more broadly. So a bit more variation in presentation. So people who were, more communicative, but still, had symptoms. Because the implication is that Donald was relatively or periodically nonverbal.
Okay.
Dr. Asperger is become pretty well known, particularly more recently, for being a massive prick.
Okay.
Right.
I cannot overstate how much of a prick he is.
Why is he a prick, Daisy?
He was a member of the Austrian Fascist and Nationalist Party.
Okay.
Which was called the Fatherland Front. And he was a eugenicist.
That's pretty decent prick points, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's not, a little bit questionable. Some people disagree with what he was saying. That's pretty strong evidence of,
Oh, it gets worse.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I think this is our first Nazi, everybody. How exciting.
Should we have some sort of alarm confetti cannon?
I don't know about confetti cannon. That sounds like we're celebrating.
I realised that as soon as I said it, actually. So
I think an alarm would be good.
Yeah. You know, being Austrian, he was a medical officer during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
He still was carrying on with, you know, a lot of his regular research work, as well as doing sort of, you know, wartime type things. And he was doing a lot of them.
When you say medical officer, are we talking he was on the front, or are we talking he was doing nice things in those lovely holiday camps that they set up for Jewish and disabled and ethnic minority people?
He was technically neither.
Okay.
So he had sort of set up a sort of school, like almost like a boarding school,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of children went when their parents couldn't look after them.
Mm-hmm.
And he would, you know, try and educate them, you know, give them room and board and do his research on them, which did result in, well, I said that resulted in, like, it happened accidentally. No, he knowingly sent multiple disabled children to one of the clinics in Nazi Germany to be experimented on, and most realistically and most likely killed in the Action T4 program, which, as we all know, was one of the earliest Nazi Nazi rounds to sort of get rid of a lot of the disabled people before
anybody else.
Before anybody else, before we could get in the way too much.
Yeah.
Because I think Hitler probably knew that we would kick up a fuss. Realistically, we are quite stubborn.
Yeah, we've touched on this before about us not being a quiet, let's just sit there and let things happen kind of group.
Fight the power energy. I think we used. Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah. I think I was going to describe us as revolting, but not, you know, revolting.
Viva la revolution!
Yeah, exactly.
He was doing his work on Asperger's syndrome kind of throughout the war, but the office school where he was doing this stuff was bombed, and so, you know, a lot of that work was lost in the bombings, and it's partly because of that and other factors. And that kind of the lack of that sort of research that shows it going back further and further is a reason why the idea that, you know, autism is a new label that's only just become fashionable and it's only just been invented is partially because of that. It's difficult to elicit a particular amount of sympathy for this work being lost because it was done by such a prick. But, like, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of trying to almost it's the loss of the information rather than the loss of that anything like work connected to that person.
And it's the thing you see time and time again in kind of science history is, you know, so many experiments were done on slaves and people of color and minorities and children and, you know, people with learning difficulties and cognitive impairments, because they were not the people that had, you know, strong legal representation. They didn't have rights. And a lot of the science that we have today, we have to thank eugenicists and people who didn't care about minority groups and experimented horribly on people.
Yeah.
That's the history of science. I mean, yeah.
So it's another medical history podcast that I really like. It's Sawbones.
Yes.
I really like that, and they often go quite deep into that sort of, you know, how much kind of, you know, structural inequality has sort of, you know, contributed to, you know, our medical and scientific knowledge. Yeah, so I mean, like, that's kind of, I mean, obviously, you know, the syndrome was named after him.
Yeah,
but it's kind of, I mean, this is entirely you know, anecdotal from online. I am seeing sort of fewer and fewer people who are, you know, using Asperger's syndrome as a kind of, you know, as a label for themselves, with kind of switch to neurodiverse
rather than Asperger's.
Neurodiversity. Yeah. Well, apart from anything else, just the idea of calling something a syndrome is kind of like a very sort of like you're making a real decision.
Do you think, Daisy, that partly people are saying I'm neurodiverse rather than a syndrome is not just because people don't like the term syndrome much anymore, but because of who the syndrome is named after and the connotations of him being a Nazi, maybe?
I mean, there certainly is like much more awareness from, the community and all sorts about what this was named after and what he did. So I don't know.
No.
That's why people are switching, because there is also, this kind of it's almost like following on from the social model of disability. That's kind of, it's not like a disorder. It's not that there's something wrong with us. It's just that our brains work in a different way. So I think it stems from a bit of both. I think
it is a personal decision, I suppose. I mean, if you're happy to call it Asperger's syndrome, you're happy to call it Asperger's syndrome. But at the same time, there will be people out there that go, well, I don't want to be associated with a Nazi. I don't want that label hanging around my neck,
But then, it's because you have the syndrome that is named after him, that doesn't link you in any way to the atrocities that I can absolutely understand both sides of the coin of going, well, I don't want people to look at me and go, Asperger's, that's the Nazi. But also, people shouldn't be looking at people and going, Asperger's, that's the Nazi.
No.
Because a person's neurodiversity has all to do with the doctor that named it.
I think it would be sort of almost as much that it reminds people themselves. If I've been, diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and every time someone mentioned it, I know that's what
Nazi.
happened. But yeah, it's as we say, different people are comfortable with different labels and topics, and people have different reasons for referring to themselves as one way or the other. I'm not judging.
No.
Although I am judging Dr. Asperger because he's a prick. But
I think that's allowed.
Yeah. I mean, if we've got to the point where we're not allowed to judge a Nazi, well then. So all of this work had been sort of done during the 20th century. So 20th century being 1900s. It still took the medical establishment a long time to catch up. It was 1980 was when they officially differentiated autism from schizophrenia.
Wow,
really?
1980.
That is incredible.
So that was when the DSM, which is the previously mentioned big book of mental disorders.
What's it? Diagnostics?
It's something in Latin, I think.
Is it? Okay. I was going to say I have heard it, but I don't remember what it is.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that important.
Diagnostic something manual, maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
I think it's one of these where the answer when you look it up, I think a lot of the time is in Latin, and I think they might have had the Latin and then had the acronym and then gone, no, the words that the acronym stands for are stupid. We're going to make up a new one. And then come up with like diagnostic salami manual.
Lucy enjoyed that. She needs a minute.
Daisy, I think I want to be your best friend. Oh my god.
Don't say that, Luce. Tom's listening.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry, Tom.
The 1980s is kind of when everything started to catch up. And that's, how you get into the things that have happened more recently, like kind of, the gradual expanding of the diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And, all of these talks about how difficult it is for women comparatively to become diagnosed. And even so, the diagnostic criteria are really, they're so narrow. Okay. And they're so narrow to the point where if you're visually impaired, it's almost impossible to get a diagnosis.
Really?
Because so many of the criteria to be diagnosed with are things like eye contact.
Yeah.
And things that involve you needing to be able to see.
Observe things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And
it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's kind of, a lot of other, disabilities as well tend to, act in ways that do not match with what the book says you will do.
No.
But you can't. The book says you're like this.
Yeah.
It's, you know, like,
this is what always gets me about diagnosing people with conditions and disabilities and things, that if for whatever reason you are slightly not as the list gives, it's like, well, it can't possibly be that. And then people go on for years struggling through a childhood, difficult teenage years, thinking, what on earth is wrong with me? And then they get to like 42 or in their 30s and it's like, oh yeah, no, that is what it is. Sorry, we got it wrong.
Yeah.
And you think, just think outside of the box a little bit. Do you know what I mean?
And we've talked before, I think, about how helpful having that diagnosis can be for getting support. And I think that's what it kind of comes down to, isn't it? Is that if your diagnostic criteria is so strict that it means that there are people who are not getting the appropriate diagnosis, and those people aren't getting access to the support they might need.
No.
Yeah, completely. It's kind of, you know, how different, you know, impairments intersect with each other.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, you know, and it's the same with all types of things. You know, I think most people who have, you know, more than one impairment can probably, you know, relate to that idea that, you know, often one of them will make the other one act differently, which makes it that much more difficult because there's, you know, so much confusion. It's like, oh, well, it must be the original thing that's just sort of being weird. It can't possibly be two things. So yeah, so that kind of brings up the history of, you know, how autism has gone up to sort of around the present day, but it kind of has skirted around a bit. They call savant. So this idea of being autistic savant, well, that's what a lot of people have always kind of associated with autism before these kind of, you know, more recent push was, you know, sort of neurodiversity, where obviously we can see the sort of whole broad range of different people and
it being a spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So autistic savant isn't really a term we use now, but there are so many accounts of, you know, savants throughout history. So there is still something called savant syndrome. So that is thought to be about 50% of people with savant syndrome are autistic.
Okay.
The other 50% have brain injury or a neurological illness or something else that is causing this sort of very singular or tiny area of extraordinary ability of knowledge in a certain subject. And so savant syndrome now tends to sort of more specifically refer to someone who is, you know, quite severely impaired with their communication. So, you know, people who are nonverbal primarily. So often those types of things were music. So like blind Tom Wiggins.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And memory. So people who can remember full conversations and perfectly exactly mimic them. And also maths and art. So those tend to be where the savant type stuff comes in.
Yeah. And that, I think, to anybody who doesn't really understand the inner workings of autism properly, they would go, okay, so it's like the Rain Man type.
Yeah.
Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory type person. And so you could describe it as your classic signs of autism in inverted commas.
But actually, that stat that you dropped, you know, that it's actually only 50% of people who display those kinds of behaviors have autism. I mean, I think that's really interesting that one of the things that most of the general public would go, oh, well, that's a sign of autism, is actually it's not just a small element of autism, but actually within that kind of savant behavior, it's only half of those people actually have an autism diagnosis.
Yeah, so you may have come across at some points, you know, one of these stories in, I don't know, Take a Break magazine or you know, The Sun or The Mail or something like that. Yeah. Just, you know, oh, I was in a car crash and now I can play the piano beautifully. And, you know, never taken a lesson and, you know, all of that stuff. And,
well,
you know,
I can speak fluid French and I woke up, you know, can speak.
That, I think,
that's foreign accent syndrome.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a specific thing, is where you literally wake up being able to speak another language that you don't know. That's something different, isn't it?
Theoretically, you could have a savant syndrome, be incredibly good at like taking in new languages.
Yeah.
Because that would come under the memory thing, that sort of,
That sort of thing.
you read, so you hear one person talking or something, and you've just kind of learned it all.
Sticks, yeah.
But yeah, so it's kind of that sort of 50% stat is considered for kind of modern savant syndrome, and it's hard to tell going back whether the stat was the same. Obviously, we don't know because we cannot retroactively go back and prod people and do tests. Partly because it's impossible and they're dead, and partly because we're a bit nicer about this sort of thing now.
I was going to say ethically, perhaps not.
Yeah.
We could be doing. I wanted to ask Daisy if during your research about the history of autism, whether you'd come across that excellent phase in human history where we started believing that vaccinations were causing autism. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, that's a very good point. That is a bit that I didn't include, and I maybe should have.
Maybe it's a bit we can do a bit later and come back to, because that's probably like a whole episode, because that shit is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's a classic correlation versus causation thing. And probably, if anything, is one of the earlier points of evidence that shows just how many people do actually have autism, rather than, anything to do with MMR or vaccinations or anything like that. Really, what it was telling us was, oh, this is much more common than we ever thought it was. Yeah, so I think so the prevalence of autism in the population in the United States, the last time it was updated from previously thought to be 1 in every 130 people,
right,
now to 1 in every 45.
Yeah, I can believe it. No, I can believe it.
And to be fair, I think it's highly likely that it is actually higher than that.
Yeah.
And it's just that a lot of people have just kind of never considered things about the way they are to be autism or neurodiversity or
we had Louise on the show, and in her episode she's an identical twin, and she said that she always assumed that her communication issues and problems that she's had with social interaction was because she was a twin. It wasn't until she started learning about Asperger's that she went, that's what it is. It's not because I'm a twin at all.
Part of it comes from that sort of, stigma of autism that still does exist, in that, it's kind of, people don't want to connect their behaviours with it
to anything,
to a certain degree. And hopefully as it becomes, more accepted, more people will realise.
It's quite a fascinating, this episode to me, Daisy, has been absolutely fascinating. I did not know much about the history of autism. I certainly didn't know about Dr. Asperger.
No, that's really interesting.
At all. I never even realised that he was a Nazi. So it's been really, really interesting to go through the history of it, really, and I feel like I've gained much more of an understanding. So thank you.
That's all right. I'm sorry I have to bring more fascists to your attention.
It's okay. It's all right.
It's fine. If we can do anything to raise awareness of fascism, then we can hopefully help prevent it in the future. So yeah, that's I think that was good. Okay.
Thank you, Daisy.
Yes, thank you very much, Daisy.
Thank you.
And again, all our sources and stuff will be in the description. Follow us on the Twitters and all of the other social medias, and we'll see you throughout the rest of the week for more autism awareness raising.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the lABLEd podcast. If you like the show, please rate, review and subscribe. You can follow us on social media at lABLEd podcast.
Thanks go to our editor Adam Hall, our music composer Maisie Crunden, and our graphic designer Sarah Coley.
We'll see you next time.